views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Daren Jaime. And of course, people ask, what is the Social Justice Forum all about? Well, it's a show that brings you a deeper understanding into some of the inequities that many people face. Also, we talk about the issues, we present multiple viewpoints, and then we also promote civic engagement. That's all on the Social Justice Forums with yours truly, Daren Jaime. We start right now. Welcome back. With nearly 2 million people incarcerated in the United States is actually the world's largest jailer. Nearly 250,000 youth are tried, sentenced, or imprisoned as adults every year across the U.S., and over 10,000 youth are detained or incarcerated in adult jails as prisons. Putting a human face to the sobering statistics, the novel Boy with a Knife is a devastatingly detailed indictment of a criminal justice system that routinely sends youth to adult prisons and jails. Well, the narrative takes us step by step through the main character's crime, trial, and punishment, as well as their survival through prison, as well as his readjustment into regular society. The Boy with the Knife is also a searing critique of the practice of sentencing youth to adult prisons, providing a much-needed wake-up call on how we can change the laws in this country that allow children to be sentenced as adults. Joining us now to share a point of view on this matter, I'm joined by the author of Boy with a Knife and also prison activist, Jean Trounstine, and we thank you so much, Jean, for being with us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Good to have you. And as we talk about social justice and this particular issue, we look at young people and the incarceration of young people. And I know that you spent a lot of time in the criminal justice system, working in the criminal justice system. Give us your assessment of how you see things right now, particularly when it comes to incarceration and youth incarceration.
First of all, I want to say that it's appalling how many people are in prison, particularly during COVID. And I think one of the things we think about, we think about how many people are in prison in this country, but what a lot of people don't think about, and I know this is true in my state, Massachusetts, and I think it's true across the country, we have 5 times the rate of COVID in prisons and in jails as we do in our state. And we have a pretty low rate in our state, under 1%, and we have 5%. So that's 5 times as many. And I think across the country, in many states, it's worse. In New York, there are some raging cases in different facilities. So right now, we have 2 pandemics. We have the pandemic of incarceration, and we have the pandemic of COVID. Pandemic of incarceration really affects mostly Black and brown people. We have incarcerated our way into an incredibly racist system. Not that we don't have a racist society, but in terms of what you're thinking about, we have to look at how we got here as well as how we get out of here.
When we talk about incarceration, obviously a lot of problems that we have in society, but let's be honest, you cannot incarcerate your way out of some of these problems that we're having. I think so many times that this is the method that's being used, and we know that it's racist. We know that it's biased. We know that it's prejudice. Talk to me about your work, because you really confront this head on.
Well, first of all, I taught at a women's prison for 10 years, which is how I became an activist. And then I got a letter from someone who was a young man who killed someone when he was 16. This was a long time after I actually stopped working in prison. And he had been incarcerated when he was 16, first offense. It was really a shocking thing to me to see through him what happens to kids. And that's how I began to see that we send in states, every state across the country. In Massachusetts, it's as low as 14. In some states, it's as low as 12. Kids who automatically, we send them to an adult prison if they are convicted of murder. And if they're charged for murder, they get tried and therefore most often sentenced as an adult. So the epidemic, I mean, we talk about epidemic, what's happening to our youth is unconscionable. And again, I say, um, how we, how I got involved with this was through a young man who wrote me a letter, but then I got involved by meeting lots of other people, by researching, by finding out what's going on here. I mean, that's what happened to me.
Yeah. And then you write the book, Boy with a Knife. And
Yeah.
it really is a telling book. Talk to us about Boy with a Knife and the response it's gotten.
It was interesting. It got great response across the country from activists. It got, I mean, if it got, I had some very tough times with people who were victims of crime, who accused me of glorifying the perpetrator of a crime, which of course I didn't do. I just wanted to show the other side of the story, how so many kids get into crime. They have stories, they get into things because things have happened to them, and that they need a second chance too. But there are a lot of people who, it's interesting, the people who are victims of crime are often treated really horribly by our justice system. They don't get anything but the need to, they're used to identify the person who killed or harmed their loved one, and then they're discarded. They don't get therapy. And so when Boy with a Knife came out, there were protests against the book, which of course actually made the book sell more, because that's how publicity works. But I'd say one of the most positive things is the people who were in the community of New Bedford and Dartmouth, where the crime took place. Many people contacted me and thanked me for writing the real story of the crime.
When we talk about this crime, walk us through what happened and give us a little bit for somebody who may not be so familiar with the book.
Thank you. So Carter, I'm a professor. So when I read a story, this is what happened. I just get this letter, someone who had killed someone in a classroom. And Carter hadn't been prepared to kill anybody. He'd gone into the classroom with his buddies. They were trying to rectify a fight, as teenagers often do. And stupidly, they actually went into a classroom. And this was in 1993, before we had the kinds of security systems we have in schools. So they could walk into a classroom, and Carter ended up stabbing a boy who was involved with the crime, but who had actually not been the person that they wanted to get back at. So it was a crime in a classroom, a stabbing in a classroom. It shocked Dartmouth. It was immediately, Carter is a white boy, and so he came from a poor neighborhood. So the narrative became, poor white kid comes into our rich white neighborhood and commits crime. And that, there was that story, which of course had to be debunked. But it was really a shock for what was called a quote unquote sleepy community to have a crime committed there. And I think it's important to tell the stories of kids who you don't think are the typical perpetrators of a murder. And many people have asked me, why I chose Carter. I didn't choose Carter. He chose me because he wrote me a letter.
Amazing. And we talk about this youth incarceration. How many kids across America are actually spending time in adult prisons? And somebody says, and let's be honest, there is this perspective that, that people will take of a false narrative, that it's not about necessarily the incarceration in as much as where the incarceration takes place, meaning that we're not saying that a person should not be incarcerated, but we are saying where they're incarcerated makes a difference. And so when you have these young people that are put in adult prisons, talk to us about what you're hearing about that experience and what life is like there. We're not saying that they shouldn't be in prison. Right. It's where they're being incarcerated that's really a challenge.
No, that's really important. I think that punishment for there's lots of different ways we can exact, reckoning. I'd like to call it reckoning. That's a good word that Danielle Sered uses in her book, as opposed to punishment. Lots of ways to exact reckoning for crime. And we don't even involve the people who are victims in deciding how they want reckoning. And most of them do not want someone to go to prison for billions of years. They don't want someone to be killed. They want some kind of real thing, which is not an adult prison, because in an adult prison, what happens is you don't get education. So you take a kid who's in the middle of school, you get some sort of maybe education, but it's not guaranteed. You don't get regular healthcare. You don't get regular psychology, therapy. You don't get the kinds of things that kids need to blossom and to grow. And plus, you put them at risk when you put young people with older people who, it's not just risk of rape, but it's risk of a kind of world that they're not involved in. And you sort of force them to grow up in a way that they should not have to grow up. So that's part of it. I mean, an adult prison is a much more horrifying place for someone to be.
Yeah. And I also want to take this time to talk a little bit about life without parole, right? Because that's a very important initiative that you're also connected to. And talk to us about life without parole. A lot of people are incarcerated. We know the death penalty is one of the things that a lot of people look for when there's these crimes that are being committed. But then also an alternative, and some people say it's a healthy alternative. That's debatable. But life without parole.
One of the things that people do not understand is that life without parole is the other death penalty. And when I say it's the death penalty, is many of the people who are sentenced to life without parole die in prison. It's just a slower death. It's not a way of helping them get back to the community. It's not a way of giving them an opportunity to be a citizen. It's another purely punitive device to really take the responsibility away from, say, we're going to kill them, to killing them in another way. But that's what happens if you sentence somebody to life in prison. You sentence them to die in prison. So most people like me who are working on a lot of these issues are very much against that harsh punishment as a way of, again, dealing with harm that is created. There's lots of other ways to deal with harm. And those are the kind of things we need to explore, how to do this in a more humane way, like other countries do, not the United States. There countries let people stay in prison for 10, 12, maybe 15 years for the worst possible crimes. But we're not like that.
Yeah. So are you saying that maybe there should be a release?
I think people should be eligible for parole. I think that there should be, doesn't mean you get out. I mean, let's take, somebody, Charlie Manson, or somebody who everybody sort of thinks, who wants that guy out? I mean, I'm not going to judge what he's done. I'm not on the parole board. But if you think somebody has not really changed when they're behind bars, or would make us unsafe on our streets, there's a stopgap. There's a parole board. There's a way of saying, no, you haven't done enough. But to not be eligible to at least change your life and get on a path where you could be a contributing member of our society seems to me a mistake, because then we're saying people don't deserve to at least try. We're not guaranteeing them the chance, but we're saying they deserve the chance.
That's a huge step to take. I mean, when you think about some of the people who commit some of the most heinous crimes I do see around the world, but I think to a victim's family, what do you say to those people? Because you got a victim's family there, and here it is. My loved one's been murdered. And if my loved one's been murdered, I don't have an opportunity to bring that loved one back. And so I don't feel as though sometimes a second chance is warranted. What do you say to those?
Well, okay, so the first thing I say is, what is it that person really wants the person back, right? So that's what the person wants. You cannot get the loved one back. Then what happens? Then what do you want? Well, most of them want apologies in some way. They want someone to be sorry. They want that person to really do something that shows they will never do anything this horrible again. They want that person not to harm someone. This is from research that I'm citing. vengeance is the first step. I understand vengeance. I think and maybe you would feel, if somebody harms somebody that I loved, the first thought would be, I want them hurt. But the thought isn't an action. So we have to work through these things to get to what is it that really is going to be better for our society, not just personally satisfying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Yeah. So give me, where do you see things happening right now as far as criminal justice reform? I know that you're pretty much an advocate for a lot of criminal justice reform, particularly when it comes to the area of young people. You're coming to us out of Massachusetts, working out of Massachusetts. I've spent some time in New York working with women at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, the only state maximum federal facility. And I remember there was a point when we saw women who were actually serving life sentences actually become eligible for release because of a change in the laws in terms of how we deal with drugs and the 3 strikes you're out rule. What do you see possibly on the horizon for young people? Do you see this massive change nationally when we talk about incarceration? I know it's a state-by-state case, but can we actually see possibly a change nationally of seeing young people never end up in adult prisons?
I think there's a movement in that direction. I think there's also a movement to close many youth facilities that are not doing a good job. There's, the movement really across the country. What people like me want is for the majority of people to be kept close to home and serve their time in some way where they're close to home and can be with their families. It doesn't serve a kid. It doesn't serve him ultimately in the long run to be away from his family. So if there's a way for him to have this, whatever the punishment is that we need to exact, if there's a way to do it closer to home, and I'm not even sure it has to be punishment, it could be service, it could be, lots of things to help him become more aware of what he has done or she has done. So I think there's a movement, and I think coronavirus has helped this actually, unfortunately, but I think there's a movement to say we've got to do something to help these kids not be set up in situations where they're going to get worse, where they're not going to get better. And ultimately, I think that is better for the person who has the crime committed against them too.
Gene Trounstine, thank you so much for sharing with us. Before we leave, though, I want to get our viewers an opportunity to get connected with your book, Boy with the Knife, and then also to be connected to some of the advocacy and work that you're doing. Even though you're in Boston, listen, nationwide, there's a movement.
Well, you can contact me. I'm on Twitter, Justice with Gene, at Justice with Gene. I have a website, GeneTrounstine.com. You can find my book. And, I'm very involved in trying to, I guess we might say, as you are, it seems, make this world a better place. And we got to do it one step at a time. And I welcome anybody who wants to contact me.
Yeah, we're all trying to make the world a better. Well, I'll say I am trying to make the world a better place. I don't know if everybody's trying to make the world a better place. And if I look at the current state of affairs, I probably can't say that everybody's trying to make the world a better place. But I do know that you are. Thank you for the work that you're doing in advocating for young people. I think that it's very important that youth do have an opportunity. Not saying that we're not trying to get you out of jail, but we're trying to tell you where you go to jail. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and ultimately get out, but in a humane way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a conversation. Gene Trounstine, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All righty, guess what? You've got the information where you can get connected to her if you want to find out more about Boy with the Knife, and if you want to find out more about her work, Gene Trounstine. All right, stay with us. We've got more on the social justice forums. Come right back right after this.
It looks bleak. It feels bleak. But the city isn't shut down because our public services keep working. In spite of, and in the face of, the dangers, we can count on them. And to keep them working and funded now and in the future, we need to be counted. Self-respond now to the 2020 census at my2020census.gov.
And welcome back. Citizens Housing and Planning is a not-for-profit research and education organization focused on housing policy and planning in New York City. Their mission has been to develop and advance practical public policies to support the housing stock of the city by better understanding New York's most pressing housing and neighborhood needs. The organization's research and education work has actually helped shape public policy, improving the city's housing stock and quality of life in New York City neighborhoods. They're committed to advancing the equity through housing and planning, and New York City's next housing plan must address the diverse needs of its 3.2 foreign-born residents to ensure an equitable recovery from COVID and a thriving future for New York City. Here to share now, providing more on the point of view on this matter, we're pleased to be joined by the Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council, Jessica Katz. And Jessica, good to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Daren.
Thank you. Well, listen, let's get right at it and talk a little bit about housing. I think the whole housing landscape, particularly after COVID-19, is going to see a significant shift. And a lot of people are struggling just to pretty much make ends meet. New York, as we know, very hardly hit economically, and the housing crisis is going to be at the forefront. Talk to us about what we're seeing and what you're seeing from your perspective.
Sure. So I think certainly after COVID, housing policy has seen an elevated place and an elevated kind of crisis, even worse than it was before in New York City. This is not the first crisis that New York City has weathered. We've been through a lot in the past, but each time we weather one of these crises, be it economic or 9/11 or a natural disaster or a global pandemic, the first thing we do in order to get ourselves out of that crisis economically is to invest deeply in affordable housing. And there's a risk right now that that's not the approach that this administration at the city level is going to take. So we really want to make sure that that investment in affordable housing helps to create the economic engine that can get us out of this economic downturn.
Yeah. And when we look at affordable housing from your perspective, how do you see it shaping up across the city landscape? I mean, you have some who argue and say, listen, we've done our fair share of affordable housing across the city. From your perspective, how do you see it?
Well, I think that's part of the problem, right? The affordable housing community really started as a social justice movement. The homes on Charlotte Street, and there was a lot of activism in the South Bronx that kind of created the CDC movement and created the affordable housing movement. So while we started as a movement, say 30, 40 years ago, now we've kind of turned into more of an industry. So I think it's incumbent on the affordable housing community now to get back to our social justice roots and really remind communities of the good work that we do and why we're doing it and for who.
Yeah. And so I want to talk about the Housing Plan for a City of Immigrants report. Explain to our viewers a little bit about that and what that actually entails.
Sure. So every mayor comes into New York City with a big splashy housing plan. So if you haven't heard of this housing plan, you shouldn't be surprised. It tends to be a sort of industry facing document. And the metric to measure the success of each mayor's housing plan historically has been the number of units created or preserved. So the Mayor Bloomberg plan was 165,000 units. De Blasio upped the ante and said, I'm going to do 200,000 units, and then upped it to 300,000 units. So while I think that's a really powerful management tool that helps the staff inside HPD know if they're doing a good job or a bad job, and I worked at HPD for many years, so I just barely said we there. It's not a community engagement strategy, and it doesn't really share a lot about why we're doing the plan, where the housing is going to be, and who it's going to benefit. So it leaves a lot of, activists and community members saying, affordable for whom? What is this plan really for? So what CHPC wanted to do for the next housing plan is to kind of take what's so powerful about the unit counting metric and really increase that and apply that to a larger social purpose. So we're creating a variety of new lenses, we call them, on what the next housing plan should look like. And our first report is a housing plan for an immigrant city. So if your goal of the housing plan wasn't just to create a certain number of units, but the goal was specifically to advance and honor our past, our present, and our future as a city of immigrants, what would that housing plan look like? Very different than the kind of housing plans that are just looking at numbers of units across neighborhoods.
And when we look at those numbers, look, 3.2 million immigrants believed to be in New York City. A lot of them right there in, and right there in urban neighborhoods. Talk to us about that and really recognizing that need, because when we talk about immigrants, sometimes they're not always discussed for lack of a better saying, they're not always discussed on the front burner, but many times, many of their issues really are prevalent in society and they go unaddressed.
Absolutely. So 1 in 4 New Yorkers is born in a different country, the United States, but immigrants represent half of all business owners in New York and 45% of the workforce. So immigrants they earn less, they tend to have a higher poverty rate, but they are working more and they're more likely to start their own business. And so some of the federal policies that we're seeing that are so punitive to immigrants, as well as the threat of COVID-19 in the US and other factors, is really going to create a problem for the economic recovery of the city as a whole. So while the plan is intended to help address the disparities of the immigrant population in particular, it really is to drive the economic success of the city as a whole.
Yeah. Share with me a little bit about housing as healthcare. I know that's something that you mentioned, and it's thought of. Some people don't think about housing as healthcare. How do housing and healthcare pretty much go hand in hand?
Yeah, housing as healthcare has never been more true than since the pandemic. Many doctors and public health experts will tell you, if you tell me what zip code you live in, I can tell you how healthy you are. I don't need to take your blood pressure. I don't need to listen to your chest. Your zip code is the major determinant of health in this country. And that is shocking and also fixable. So you have the history of housing policy was to create enforcement mechanisms and building codes to reduce the likelihood of infectious diseases and the spread. So tenement laws, rules about light and air and sewers in housing 150 years ago. These were the housing policies, but their sole purpose was to improve the health of New Yorkers and stop the spread of disease. Over the last 100 years, we've made a lot of advancements in medicine. So we thought less about housing as a public health intervention, but still we have these environmental justice issues around lead paint, around asthma, which are deeply, deeply linked to neighborhood, to racism, to a history of redlining. So the history of housing policy and public health are so linked together. And now we're just kind of realizing that again in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah. And when we talk about the pandemic, obviously it's caused a lot of people to have to make adjustments. How things had to pivot for you in the wake of COVID-19?
Our work was typically going out into the community and talking to people face to face and hosting events and panels. So just sort of logistically, it's been difficult to do our work and find ways to get our message out. So I want to thank you, Daren, for giving us a new outlet to talk about our work. And then it also just, like with everybody, it kind of paired us back to what is the most critical, important things. It made everybody really personally and professionally take a look at what our priorities are. So something like housing is healthcare, which sort of seemed like just a catchphrase 6 months ago, now it's really a life and death matter.
When we talk about living, obviously we want to have healthy living. One of those things is green living, right? And I think that when we talk about green living, in a city like New York that's densely populated, having to make adjustments to improve healthcare, having to make adjustments to improve the housing crisis that we have. Green living has always been a realistic blueprint in terms of helping people to achieve both of those goals. When we talk about green living for you, how do you see green living playing out in the future?
Sure. So there's lots of ways on a kind of individual and citywide level that we need to adapt to green living and work towards a healthier built environment. So after Sandy and after COVID, we realized that climate change isn't something that's going to happen to our grandchildren. It's something that's here now, and we really need to worry about it. A lot of the city's public housing developments, for example, are in the floodplain. So we're going to have to do some really smart thinking about the impact of climate change over the next several years. And then on a micro level within our environments, we're learning a lot about the construction materials and the damage that can do to people's respiratory systems. COVID, we're starting to think about air quality, both outside and inside, in a way that we were kind of allowed to neglect before. So some of the worst zip codes for asthma in the South Bronx and Northern Manhattan are also where a lot of the COVID high incidence was.
Yeah. And so I want to ask a little bit more about moving forward, because when we talk about moving forward, advocacy is very key, very critical. Looking at COVID-19 right now, looking at the fact that there's this moratorium on evictions, looking at the city's homeless population and how that could potentially increase by way of COVID-19, and then also turning around and saying, listen, not just the homeless situation, but unemployment, all these things that actually play a way into housing. Are we looking at possibly seeing a real spike in this housing crisis post COVID-19 here in the city from your perspective?
Absolutely. We're seeing that already. And in particular, when you see neighborhoods that have a higher incidence of street homelessness, we think that's a lot because we have homeless people who would have been willing to sleep in a homeless shelter previously, but now just don't feel safe doing that. To some of your listeners, previous to my job at CHPC, I was working for the city's housing department, meeting with community boards, talking to them about supportive housing developments throughout the city as well as throughout the Bronx. And so what I really want people to understand about the homelessness issue is how interrelated these neighborhoods are. So when there's a homeless shelter on the Upper West Side that says no more, we don't need any more homeless shelters, now we need to find another location for that homeless shelter. So now that's spilled over that impact into a variety of neighborhoods all across the city. We are calling on the mayor to rezone Soho, something that maybe your listeners wouldn't think was an issue for them. But in fact, the housing crisis and gentrification across the city happened precisely because we've limited the amount of housing that happens in core Manhattan neighborhoods such as Soho. So then people who have modest means have to go looking elsewhere for an apartment. So that starts to have a spillover effect on the rents in all sorts of other neighborhoods. So I think going forward, we're really going to have a reckoning with the public health implications and also with how the neighborhoods and the boroughs are related to one another and get away from this idea that I only have to worry about what happens in my own neighborhood. Yeah.
How can the public be better engaged with the work that you're doing? Because I think a lot of people say, listen, yeah, I am affected by this. COVID-19 has not just impacted us on an economic front, but definitely a lot of people are definitely challenged on the housing front. How can people get connected to the work and some of the advocacy that you guys are doing?
Sure. So our website is chpcny.org. So all of our research is on there. You can follow us on social media. I've written a series of op-eds about what I think this mayor should do and what I think the next mayor should do. So we'll always be happy to push people in the right direction for their advocacy work.
Yeah, don't want to be too political, but do you feel as though right now currently that our current mayor is doing enough in the area of housing, or do you feel as though that we should see a dramatic shift in what goes on?
So I think we've seen a tremendous volume of affordable housing development from this administration that I think we should all be proud of as a city. What I think we're missing is a sense of community engagement around why we're doing the work that we're doing and how. So I think that there hasn't been a lot of good explanation from City Hall about why the work that they're doing is so important. And I think there are, I've been very hard on this mayor recently about his leadership post-COVID, but I think there are some things that he can do to round out the end of his administration with, some real track record of success. So as I spoke about, we'd really like him to rezone Soho. We would like him to focus the affordable housing that is being created for essential workers. So, I don't know if in your neighborhood, in my neighborhood, everybody at 7 o'clock, we all opened our windows and banged pots and pans and made a big round of applause. That was lovely. That made me feel really good, but it didn't do a lick of good for the essential workers. So we're asking for the mayor to focus the affordable housing pipeline that exists on essential workers specifically. The third thing is around basement apartment conversions and equitable code enforcement.
And when we talk about code enforcement, I know that you talked about you talked and brought up equitable code enforcement. Give us a little bit about this, because some people really are not aware about how things play out with code enforcement and the disparity that's there. We only got a couple of minutes, but I do want to get into the disparities when it comes to code enforcement.
Sure. So code enforcement is equally applied across the city. So everyone is following the same rules or supposed to follow the same rules. But the difference between equality and equity is really key here. So the way in which typically a code enforcement for an existing homeowner, for example, would come down is through a 311 call. So you get an anonymous complaint, usually from a neighbor, sometimes from a tenant. And what we've seen is there's a growing body of data that shows that 311 calls about code enforcement and quality of life issues are much more likely to take place in neighborhoods that are changing or neighborhoods that are on the border of different ethnic and racial groups. So that worries us, right? We need to be concerned that we're putting a lot of power in, the neighbor across the street to really rain down a lot of very onerous enforcement on somebody. The rules are the rules. Sometimes the rules are good. Sometimes we think they should be changed. But I think the way in which they're enforced, we really need to take a second look at.
That cry for justice continues to go out. Let's go before we wrap up. Tell me what's coming around the corner for you guys, and how people can just stay tuned.
Sure. So we talked about New Lens for a City of Immigrants and Housing is Healthcare. And next week, we're doing an event about a feminist housing plan. So 3 out of 4 households in NYCHA are female-headed households. 85% of the families in DHS shelters are headed by women. The women earn less, they work more, they earn less. So these are all gender equity issues that we think, again, when you act like things are gender neutral, you might be missing some real equity issues. So we're going to get a bunch of people together. Everybody's welcome. You could register for the event on our website to brainstorm about what a feminist housing plan would look like.
All right. Well, Jessica Katz, we're going to leave it there. She is the Executive Director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. Thank you so much for sharing with us here on the Social Justice Forum.
Thanks, Daren. Great to be here.
Glad to have you. All right, listen, you got Jessica's information as to how you can stay connected, find out more about the housing crisis. It continues to be a topic of conversation right here in New York City. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere. We still have more show coming up. We'll be right back right after this.
Hi, I'm Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr., and I'm making sure that the Bronx counts is my priority. That's why I'm urging everyone to fill out the 2020 census. The 2020 census is important because it would allow for the federal government to determine how much money and resources the Bronx is going to need for the next 10 years around healthcare, education, housing, roads, representation, and so many other things. What does it mean exactly? Just imagine if you are organizing a party or an event and you send out 100 invitations, but only 50 people RSVP, and you only prepare for 50 people, and yet 100 people showed up. You're gonna be short of food, seats, tables, chairs. That's why it is important that 100% of us here in the Bronx fill out the 2020 census. It is easy, it is confidential, it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or undocumented. We need everybody to fill it out. Now let's all get together and make the Bronx count.
And welcome back. Our next guest is an author, not just an author, he's an award-winning author, an educator, entrepreneur, Fulbright recipient, and also a TEDx speaker. In his novel, Resilience, Killing Fields to the Boardroom, he invites readers on an inner journey of transformation, sharing how SALT was a necessary component along the way. Being a genocide survivor and a refugee of the Khmer Rouge killing fields of Cambodia, he developed the SALT model, surviving, adapting, loving, and transforming, as a means of helping him overcome the struggles of his youth, including prejudice, abuse, as well as childhood violence and dyslexia. Here to talk now about his story as well as his book, I am joined by the Kotouc Endowed Chair and Professor at Bellevue University, and also COO of Global Education Initiatives at Ztudium, Dr. Emad Rahim. Did I say it right? Ztudium?
Ztudium.
Ztudium. Okay, I got it. Dr. Emad Rahim, our guest here. Thank you so much for joining us on the Social Justice Forum.
I'm happy to be here, Daren. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, brother, and it's good to have you here sharing with us as we talk a little bit about your work, your life, and really your story, because your story is so impactful. When we talk about social justice, that's the topic of this show. But literally somebody such as yourself who really has come from a really troubled past to a very glowing and powerful present, and definitely looking to a powerful future. Talk to us a little bit about your work, because I'll start off with your life, right? Growing up in the killing fields of Cambodia, not an average person's journey.
Yeah. You know, it's a story that I didn't know too much about until I would say my late teens. You know, I was one of those people that were afraid of learning about my history, because, you know, once you learn about your history, once you know your story, you have to own it, right? You're responsible for it. And I think I was afraid of it for a very long time. And also, I didn't want to, you know, stick out, especially in a community that's predominantly Puerto Ricans, predominantly Black. You know, there's not too many people that look like me on the west side of Syracuse, in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. So I didn't want to stick out, right? And it wasn't until I want to say I was about 18, 19 when I started asking those hard questions, like who is my father, right? Where's my father from, and what exactly was the situation like when I was born? And I found out that I was born in a concentration camp. So not a refugee camp, but a concentration camp. And the day that I was born, my father was being tortured. He was eventually executed. I had an older brother that I never met that died of starvation and illness in the same camp. That we also spent almost 2 years in a refugee camp in Thailand. And it wasn't until I was probably about 4 is when we arrived to America, and we ended up in Syracuse, but then quickly moved to Sunset Park, Brooklyn, New York. And that's, you know, that's when I started like as far as back I could remember. I remember Sunset Park, Brooklyn, 61st Street.
So you remember that, but as far as the early beginnings of being over there in a concentration camp, when you found out that you were actually a product of a concentration camp, and knowing how, you know, your father died and knowing the struggles with your brother, talk to me about your immediate reaction.
So in regards to the full scope of the story, I learned about the full scope of the details when I was 18, 19. But actually, back when I was about 13, I discovered that my stepfather was not my biological father, actually, because when we came to America, my mother had gotten married in the refugee camp. She met a man, and he became my stepfather. But until I was about 13, I always was brought up believing he was my biological father. And it wasn't until he was an abusive man. And it wasn't until I was about 12 when we got into a big fight, and I ran away because I was afraid that he was going to kill me. And I was homeless for about 2 weeks, living out on the streets of Syracuse, New York. And I ended up living with my adopted uncle and my adopted sister, an older sister that was married. And I stayed with her about another 2 years. And then I got into a fight with my uncle. And it was the fight that brought out that the truth. You know, during the fight, he called me a bastard, right? And it was me asking more questions about what does he mean by calling me a bastard. And it wasn't until that when I realized that he wasn't my father. And it changed everything, right? It made me question my life. It made me question my past. It made me question my truth.
And the truth is that you were able to persevere and make it, but not without a struggle. You author a book now, and it's talk about resilience, and it just recently came out. Talk to us about resilience and how that's coming forward.
You know, I did a lot of reflection writing this book. It took about almost 4 years. I kept on writing, and then I would throw it away, write it, throw it away. And I went to Phoenix, Arizona. I got invited by another author who did a lot of leadership writing, and he knew that I was frustrated in writing this book. So he invited me to do almost like a vision board project. We went to his house. He asked me questions. We went over my story, and he kind of spread everything, almost like what's behind me. Like he spread pieces of my stories all over the place, and we combined it. And then he goes, as an educator, I don't know if you want to write this like a traditional memoir. Maybe you should write like a workbook. and use it as a tool to inspire and motivate people. And instead of writing a traditional book, let's invite people to write their own thoughts and ideas. So that's where resilience came about in regards to the proper tools and techniques. I never really had that, right? I never went to some type of workshop. I never got therapy. It was my resilience, right? The life experiences, the trials and tribulations of learning from trials and errors, overcoming adversity. That's what made me stronger, right? That's what made me reflect on life and made me want better and do better. So we use resilience as a model to, to kind of push people forward and make people think about their life and their own journey. And instead of thinking about only the bad things, think about the good things that they've also experienced. Think about the positivity in their life, and look for those tools, techniques, lessons learned in those life experience to move you forward. And that's where resilience came about. That's where the SALT model came about, where you mentioned survive, adapting, love, and transformation.
And that's a powerful model, SALT. But talk about the transformation, because you've actually been able to make this transformation. And as I started, you're an award-winning, you're award-winning. You've got an educational platform that is, second to none. TEDx speaker. When did that transformation occur for you to say, listen, because a lot of people can look at their past and say, you know what, I'll check out because of all these bad things that have actually happened. You've actually taken your past and been able to parlay it into an amazing life story. When became the day for transformation for you?
Right. So it was bits and pieces of my life. So I don't think anyone woke up one day and said, hey, I had it. It's only in the movies, right? Like they woke up one day, I had it, and everything, changes. They go cold turkey and they change their life. It was bits and pieces. I think the first half was me owning my story, me making the commitment to finish school, having a mentor by the name of Mr. Willie Dardell, who supported me, who took me in as almost like his adopted son, and pushed me forward. But I think the real transformation was when I got married. I got married at 21. I met and wed my wife, in a month. We've been married 21 years now. And then my daughter was born, and it changed everything. It made me look at my life. It made me more motivated. I wanted more for her. And then it was like bits and pieces of those things, right? Like I was always the person that had to work extra, right? So I always worked 3 or 4 jobs and then went to school. And I realized that's not a true, that's not real life, right? That's not something you want to live, right? Where you're constantly living check to check, where you're working weekends, evenings, where you don't see your children, you don't see your wife, and you're just trying to make ends meet. And I realized that's not what I want. And I realized education is my path out. And luckily I had a professor that realized that I was dyslexic, right? He realized that I was dyslexic. And instead of giving me sympathy, he provided me empathy, right? And provided me resources, guidance, and support that fueled my dyslexia into something that I could use. And this is where resilience come about. Instead of looking at dyslexia as a weakness, instead of looking at my past experiences as a weakness, he explained it as a journey. This is a journey that will make you stronger. And dyslexia is actually a good thing for you. It's not a label. It's an empowerment tool. And that's how I explained it to him. He said, listen, it's not a label. It's not a stigma. It's only a label and stigma if you make it. It's an empowerment tool because now you realize you could learn. You just learn different. And that was a powerful experience. I think that was probably the thing that transformed my life in regards to being an educator. Right.
But you've also become, but not the country, but you've also become a vessel that gives this information of power and empathy out, right? And so I think that when you talk about power and empathy, this is something that you receive, but it's also something that you're now imparting to people as being an important life force.
When it comes to empathy, you just can't receive it, right? You have to give it back. Right. That to me is an important piece when it comes to being an educator, when it comes to being an entrepreneur, when it comes to be a social justice activist. Whatever you do in order to improve your life, you have to be able to transform the life of the people around you. Right. You can't live your life as a silo and expect everything to be perfect. And I know I would not be here if it wasn't for those people that supported me, that pushed me, that mentored me. I had a lot of great mentors in my life. So I would never say I did this alone. It was just one person, or it was one experience, or I woke up one day. There was always a lot of people that pushed me, that pulled me, that that shoved me, right? Refused to give up on me. And so I refuse to give up on people. Take that very serious, right? I have long, deep conversation with that person. Say, listen, if you're asking me to be a mentor and I accept this, it doesn't end in a year or two. This is a long life journey, right? It's a long life friendship, and sometimes it's going to be good, sometimes it's going to be bad, but I'm there for you, right? And because those people were there for me.
Right. And when we talk about being there for people, you are there as an educator. You're an educator right now. And all of us are trying to navigate this COVID-19 pandemic. Talk to me about being that educator in a time such as this. What's it been like for you trying to reach the masses and to take them to a higher level in education, given the fact we're amidst the pandemic?
Yeah, it's been a roller coaster, right? I think that's probably the best way you can describe it. I was fortunate enough where I've always taught predominantly online, right? Most of my classes that I've taught, the programs that I operate as a dean were majority online or hybrid already. And I come from a hybrid background because as a working adult, I've always had to go to school and work full time. So I know what that space is like from both as an educator and as a student. My struggles often is the experience and ability that I had before COVID was to connect with people in real life, real time, and in a personal space, because I spent most of my time traveling the country, talking at graduations, facilitating workshops, giving keynote speeches, giving commencement speeches, doing book signings. So I'm always out there in the public, just spreading love. And then now it's a different experience trying to do the same thing over Zoom, right? Over Skype, trying to motivate, inspire somebody by way of storytelling, without being in front of them, right? Without giving that energy, without giving that emotion. And then also it's very hard to receive that energy, right? When you stay at someone back in Zoom and they give you that glaze, that glaze look.
Glazed and confused look, yeah.
But I think, I'm still blessed in regards to that. I think the thing that we have to consider all those teachers in public school, right? The ones that are teaching for the first time and struggling to provide the same quality of education to kids, right? The kids that are at home, also that are also struggling, right? That are also juggling. I mean, we have kids in our community that don't have strong wireless, that don't have the right technology. Their parents are not equipped. Their parents are not educated in regards to how to use this technology, and they may be working adults, right? So
Right.
we have young people, we have teenagers that are maybe at home going to school, but also taking care of their siblings, fixing them lunch, breakfast, dinner while their parents are working. And they're trying to do this while also going to school and working with a teacher that is also struggling on their end. So I think that's where the empathy and sympathy and conversation and resources, I think, needs to go.
I got a question for conversation. I'm looking at you right now, and I'm looking right behind you. What is going on behind you on that board? I mean, I see a whole lot of stuff. What's that?
Well, it's instead of I'm trying to be productive, right? So if I'm not flying around and meeting people, I figured I just get more certifications, right? So this is actually an agile project management certification. There's like principles, values. My background is in project management, so this is more of an IT certification that I'm preparing for. And it actually, I mean, look at this. It took over my entire back wall, and then and there's sticky notes all over the floors. There's books. It's a mess in here.
You should see my place. I got books all over the place myself. I mean, I think COVID-19, I mean, I already was, a guy who studied, but I mean, I think my books, my studies just increased so much more during COVID-19 because we just can't go out and do the things that you want to do. But I want to get a chance before we get out of here for you to just give a little message to possibly, a young person that might be out there struggling educationally, somebody who may feel like, listen, I haven't had the best background, but yet and still resilience and being able to make it.
Yeah, so going back to the tools that I mentioned, right? So I didn't go to those top schools. I barely graduated high school. Much of my young adult life was working in human services, working with foster children, working with at-risk children. So I didn't make a lot of money, right? I went to community college, struggled in community college, was an EOP student, lost my EOP scholarship actually. But once again, reflecting on my resilience, reflecting on everyone's resilience, it's knowing that you have this grit, you have this ability inside of you, right? You just need to utilize it. You need to look inward, right? Instead of outward, look inward and understand that you have overcome a lot. You have overcome a lot of adversity. You have overcame just tremendous trials and tribulations to get here, and you're still here. But in order to move forward, you have to create a plan, right? You have to put that plan in action. You have to surround yourself by positive people that will push you, that will love you, that will motivate you. And this is where the SALT model came in, right? The SALT model stands for survival, adapting, love, and transformation, because many of us are just in the survival mode, right? We're living day to day, check to check. We're just trying to make ends meet, right? But that's not a way to live, right? So once you understand and acknowledge you're in survival mode, we have to move you to adapt. And once you adapt, you can be able to be a lot more agile. You can create a plan. You can make sure that you're putting yourself in the right environment to move forward. So adaptation requires you to create tools and techniques to help you move forward. And then we need to surround ourselves with people that love us. And that's something as a young man growing up on the west side of Syracuse, in Sunset Brock, Brooklyn, raised by a single parent, I didn't really know what love was, especially love from my brothers, love from another man, love from a father figure. I never understood that. No one explained that to me. But once I realized that, it's a powerful tool. It's a powerful message. It's a supportive, motivating message. So surround yourself with people that love you, that push you, that fuel you, right? And luckily I have an amazing wife that does that. So when you have all these things in place, then you move to the transformation mode, right? You move to a process where you think about where you want to be, where you want to go, right? It doesn't have to be big, right? It could be steps. Next year I want to earn this degree, or 2 years I want to earn my master's, and then 3 years I want to be in this position. But when you do that, you have to figure out, what does it take for me to get there, right? What does it look like? What do I need to do? What do I need to have? What do I need to know? So you put that goal up here, and you create those steps to get there.
Dr. Emad Rahim, thank you so much for joining us here on the Social Justice Forums. Before we leave, please, I want to give you an opportunity to tell people how they can get a copy of that book.
Well, you can get the book, Resilience from the Killing Fields of Cambodia. Look it up in, the Killing Fields to the Boardroom. Look it up on Amazon.com. Look up my name, so Emad, E-M-A-D, last name Rahim, R-A-H-I-M, right on Amazon. Thank you.
All righty. Dr. Emad Rahim, our guest here on the Social Justice Forum. Thank you, my brother, for being with us and sharing here on the show. Well, we have come to the end of our show today. Want to thank you for joining us. Now, listen, if you want to catch any of the recablecasts, please don't hesitate. BronxNet's channel 67, Verizon Files channel 2133, or of course, anytime on the web at BronxNet.org. Also, stay connected to us on our social media platforms at BronxNet TV. If you want to join in the conversation, please go ahead, share on social media. Let us know. We're glad to be connected. You never know. Hey, your comments, your perspective, it just may make it here on the show. We want you to come back and join us next week, where we continue to elevate the conversation as well as bring further awareness around the globe. For all of us here on the Social Justice Forum, I am Daren Jaime. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you on the next one, where we continue to enlighten you and take it even higher.